All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us, whether you are in person or online. For those of you joining us via your computer or your phone, we have a very exciting opportunity today. This is a hybrid webinar. There is a live in-person audience over at Coventry Business School in the UK, as well as all of you joining us from all over the world via the web. So we are excited to have you here with us. As always, we encourage you to use the chat, ask your questions. We will be taking questions at the end. There'll be a Q&A session, as well as those of you that are live in person. I know that you all have your phones and are also joining the chat as well. So don't worry, we'll be moderating that and answering all of your questions as we get going. I see both rooms are starting to fill up. So without any further talking from me, I'm going to hand it over to GBSN CEO Dan LeClaire. Dan?
Thank you, Emma. And I noticed that the virtual room was filling up as you were talking, and maybe just repeating one thing that we are live from the class, Professor Ward's class, which is great in this never-ending, it seems, experience with the pandemic. The opportunities to bring communities together to learn from each other and to experiment with new things has been, if there is one thing that's been good about COVID, almost everything's been bad, of course, but if there is one good, it's that opportunity to experiment and to innovate. And this is no exception. In fact, I want to start by saying that one of the things we've appreciated about Coventry joining GBSN is that in many ways we're about breaking boundaries at GBSN, doing things that perhaps seem not within the scope of what business schools do. And a good example of this is an event or series of events and experiences that we're running now called GBSN Beyond. And we know there are teams, student teams from Coventry registered for the Humanitarian Logistics Challenge. So we're bringing together students at business schools to help not only to frame the problems, but to introduce feasible solutions that make our communities more resilient in the face of disasters. This is not traditional for business schools, but we think we can make a big difference. And that's just one example. So we really appreciate the engagement of Coventry and GBSN and GBSN Beyond. And that's also why I'm gonna use that as a launch point to introduce Professor Ward. She is not only a professor, but she's also the academic dean at Coventry Universities for the Faculty of Business and Law. But she's also the director of the Art and Management Initiative at Coventry. But I think it's fair to say that her academic career has been built on pushing those boundaries of what we understand, what we even think about in business schools and in business, looking at not only the jobs we all think are most attractive, but at times looking at jobs that might be perceived as unpleasant or dirty in some way, to look beyond business into health and to look at industries that might not seem the norm. And I could go on, I won't, because we want to get started here, but thanks for your work, Professor Ward, pushing the boundaries of what we do in business education across sectors and within the scope of research. So without any further delay, Professor Ward, it's all yours. We look forward to this experience as much as your ideas and insights.
Thank you, Dan. A really lovely introduction. I think one of the nicest that I've ever had, actually. So thank you very much for that, and beautifully segues into what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to try and screen share. Hopefully I can do this without the world crashing on me. I don't know whether that's it. Hopefully you can see that in slide sharing mode. So yeah, thank you very much then for the opportunity, not only to present at for the Global Business Society Network, but also to welcome our Coventry full-time MBA students. And as Dan said, we are live streaming from our London campus as part of the 10th anniversary celebrations of our London campus. And you know, in that kind of pushing boundaries way, that's absolutely what Coventry's done in setting up a host of campuses across the UK and now into Europe, to really push the boundaries of widening participation for higher education. So as we've kind of attempted to do this blended event, as Dan said, it is one of the positives, I think, of COVID. And I guess, you know, it has forced us to reimagine the way that we work. And in doing so, it's extended the voices, the reach, the influence of leaders, because we're able and much more comfortable, I guess, and eloquent in our abilities to exchange views across much broader communities and distances. So perhaps it's now, you know, it's an opportunity really for us to really start to question and challenge how we lead and what the consequences of our leadership activities are, both on us, but also to those around us. And as Dan alluded to in his introduction, I've spent the last 20 years researching emotional labour alongside developing my own leadership skill set. And today I want to share with you, by drawing on some of those reflections, I guess, and marrying those two things together. So not only the theoretical conceptualization of emotional labor and its kind of trajectory as a concept, and how that has, I guess, observed and mirrored the changes in society and business, but also to think about that in relation to my own experiences as a leader in business schools, and to give you at least one tangible example of how that relationship has manifested itself in my experience. So the title of my talk then is very loosely based on the classic Clint Eastwood film, The Good, the Bad and the Ugly. You know, it's a great film to watch on a rainy Sunday afternoon, but you don't need to know the plot line in order to follow my presentation, you will be relieved to know. So let's get started. You know then, we know that leadership is complex and varied, both in practice, but also in its theoretical conceptualization. So leadership theories are diverse, from traits to behaviors, leader-focused, follower-constructed, but there is a kind of a sense or a trajectory within that literature that acknowledges the human side of leadership and the importance of making connections. And, you know, I've just noted here, I guess, a few of those seminal constructs, you know, that ability to influence, that ability to manage meaning, to be perceived as authentic, to focus on the transformational. Now, all of these things, you know, whilst they are something that we, I think, aspire to as leaders, we have to acknowledge that they come with a cost. They're not cost neutral. So none of these things, leadership is not possible without a concerted effort from that leader to manage their own emotions. And they do that in order to influence the feelings of others, those that they are attempting to lead, those that they are attempting to shift perceptions of. And so this really makes us think about the construct of emotional labor. So I could talk literally forever and a day about this, so somebody might need to stop me. I'm hoping that I can give you a kind of top slice introduction, enough to facilitate, you know, the kind of the trajectory of the presentation. In 1983 then, Hochschild's seminal work, The Managed Heart, was published. She defines emotional labour as the management of feeling to create a publicly observable facial and bodily display. Emotional labour is sold for a wage and therefore has exchange value. So her work is very much rooted in marks. And it requires one to induce or suppress feelings in order to create the outward countenance that produces a proper state of mind in others. What does that mean? That means if I smile and I'm positive and I'm happy and I'm going to make you feel like that, okay? What we're talking about then is that might not be naturally how I feel right now or in a particular context, but I will purposefully work on managing the way I am perceived to feel in order to make you feel a particular way. And that has exchange value. Organizations are purchasing that ability from people. And the Managed Heart really set this out quite clearly through a comparative analysis of cabin crew, used to be referred to as air hostesses, and debt collectors who work for an airline. And one of the key ideas there was then that, you know, the cabin crew were paid to smile, to tolerate a degree of sexual harassment, to always be positive and shiny and well presented, even though they may have done a 20-hour shift on a long haul flight to the US and back. Whereas the debt collectors were paid to phone people who owed the airline money and be threatening and intimidating in order to retrieve those funds. So essentially what the Managed Heart does is demonstrates how organizations are paying for people to manage how they feel and how they can make other people feel. So hopefully I've explained that in an accessible way. And 38 years of research has emerged from this text and this idea. 38 years of research in a plethora of subject areas and disciplines, from psychology, nursing, education, sociology, health, each having a slightly different perspective, each taking a different kind of epistemological view in how it's researched, the methodologies that are adopted. But fundamentally then, emotional labour as a theoretical construct has developed through an observation that the nature of work had changed. When you were working in manufacturing settings, you went to work and you were paid for your physical labour, your manual skill set, maybe your technological expertise. With the advance of the service sector then, the focus shifted. You were then paid for that emotion work that you were doing, that ability to perform emotional labour. And so each of our different disciplines that use or look and research emotional labour focus on different aspects of that interaction. So what are the psychological challenges of doing that, of being expected to give more of yourself than you ever had done before, for example? And so we've got a kind of very disparate and very broad understanding of the concept across a variety of disciplines. What I think is useful for us to think about is how emotional labour takes place within organisations, and this being those organisations being characterised as emotional arenas. And this is drawing on Feynman's work, and actually not a body of work that he progressed in any major way, unfortunately. I think there are lots of opportunities here. What Steve Feynman is talking about then are the public display and feeling rules that define the context that we are in. So let's think about that in a really, I guess, simplistic way. If you are attending a funeral, at least in the UK context, we would expect a certain set of behaviours, feelings to be expressed in that context. If you are at a wedding or a birthday party, there is a different set of behaviours and feelings that are acceptable within that context. If one of you in my kind of physical eye line at the moment started to cry, I would be quite concerned that that behaviour was not perhaps, you know, expected of what would happen in a classroom. So this is what Feynman refers to as emotional arenas. We define what is acceptable emotionally in different contexts. And in order to demonstrate acceptable behaviours within those contexts, we perform our emotions. Inside, you might be struggling with something personally, but you come to work or you come into an education setting and you perform a particular sense of self, if you like. You occupy a particular set of emotions that are deemed acceptable within that context. And this is the same then for leaders. And what I want to think about in a worked example with you, really from my own experience, is how challenging that can be. Because organisations still today are defined by a certain set of feeling rules. And those feeling rules are of professionalism, of rationality, of a lack of emotion. You don't want your leader to be too happy, too sad, too excitable. We expect a certain level of almost dispassionate authority. But at the same time, we expect our leaders to be influential, to have vision, to be authentic. And so I want to kind of give you an example that I experienced as a leader in a business school. And I have to caveat this by saying this was not at Coventry. This was at another institution. So my example is the good of emotional labour is that you can make people feel better. It makes you feel good quite often when we're performing empathetic emotional labour. We had a situation where students, female students, were telling us that they had been sexually assaulted on our campus. As leaders, we have a moral responsibility to deal with that. We also have a responsibility to that individual to respond to them in a time of crisis and need in an appropriate way. We did that. We had a team of people doing that, a really kind of a positive relationship with those students. We were listening, we were taking them seriously, we were trying to support them. My role then as a leader in that particular context was to try and do something about this in response to this issue. What these women asked for was a safe space on campus. They were scared of being on campus, outside of their lectures, outside of the kind of the gaze of the academics and a position of authority. And they didn't want to be in the library or sat in the cafe because they were scared of you know, people seeing them, of the similar things happening again. And so we wanted to set up these safe spaces on campus for these women. As a leader, I had to negotiate, lobby, argue extensively for that resource. So not only were we dealing with the difficult emotions of the victims, but I was then having to go to try and lobby to those more senior than I, to estates teams, to our student experience teams to say that this is a really important thing that we do. Okay. And there were concerns from the institution. If we do this, we admit we've got a problem on campus. You know, what role are we playing then in that? How are we going to ensure that these spaces really are safe if we refer to them as safe spaces? How are the students going to get access to those rooms? We all know the challenges of swipe card access on university campuses. You know, this was an added layer of complexity that required working through. It took 12 months of lobbying, negotiating, compromising to get that resource. 2 rooms on campus where we could, you know, offer women a safe space. It was great. We got there. We got there in the end. It was a real win. It was, you know, a very positive experience for the team. But for me as an individual leading that project, it was incredibly challenging. You sympathize, you want to support, but then at the same time you have to go and advocate, retell those stories in order for them to be powerful. Living that, managing that multiplicity of emotions in a variety of contexts in order to lead appropriately is challenging. It takes its toll on the individual. And being successful in lobbying for change, and change as quite dramatic as that, in an incredibly conservative institution, then singles you out as a leader, as somebody that is incredibly effective, somebody who can get things done, can achieve the impossible. You then become almost a magnet for everybody else's problems. You know, they want you to help support and fix that as an issue. That's challenging. That's the dark side of leadership, is that you absolutely want to do that. You want to help people, but leadership is about compromise. It's about trying to balance all of those different competing ideas. And we know that from the leadership literature on paper, but the lived experience of that and how that feels is incredibly demanding. And so where this idea of emotional labor comes in is we can use emotional labor as a lens through which to see leadership. And that doesn't just mean the positive aspects, the empathetic aspects of leadership, i.e. the good. You know, yes, it requires emotional labor in order to share a vision, to influence, to be authentic. But it also requires a different type of emotional labor, to lobby, to compromise, to have those difficult conversations, to create business cases and present them in particular contexts. And then you go home at night and you close the door and you have to look at yourself in the mirror. You have to be able to sleep at night. You have to be able to reconcile all of these kind of competing demands on you as an individual, as a leader. So, is emotional labor a leadership skill? I would argue yes. Plenty of others agree. A really interesting edited collection then from Marion is at Wyatt, particularly good chapter on toxin handlers. And I just wanted to touch on this as a concept briefly, and for us to start thinking about leaders as, or some leaders potentially as being toxin handlers. And so what we understand by this concept is that these difficult emotional encounters can or have the potential of becoming toxic. They erode our resilience, our psychological strength, and that can eat away at us. And it's how long you can do that for, how long you can be in those positions of leadership and manage that complexity of the demands on your emotions. And so I guess just signposting in a way, but our book in 2015 now, gosh, The Dark Side of Emotional Labor really focuses on telling a different story. The emotional labor construct is very much being positioned across most disciplines actually as the performance of empathy, of positivity, the air hostess with a smile. But actually, that was only half of Ho Shield's story. She was also looking at the need to intimidate, to scare in the work of the debt collectors. But interestingly, that part of the story has almost been marginalized. And what I've spent quite a bit of time trying to do is shine a light on that dark side of emotional labour, to ask organisations why they don't value, celebrate almost a variety of emotions in organisational contexts. You know, why is it that our emotional arena in organisations is still quite narrowly defined? So, putting this in the context of business school leadership then. Business schools are cash cows, if you like. They generate income at scale for universities. This is almost a universal law. They operate in highly competitive markets, and they require engagement with a variety of stakeholders. Now, they come then with significant economic responsibilities. So business schools were implicated in the literature as contributing to the financial crisis of 2008. How come we have all these MBA students that are educated in top business schools, they're leading these organizations, and behaviors happened within organizations that led to catastrophic economic consequences. Interestingly then, the UK government has positioned business schools as playing a significant role in supporting economic recovery post-pandemic. And I put there post-Brexit in brackets because actually I think Brexit is the bigger threat, quite honestly, to the UK economy as we are currently seeing. So business schools have a wicked challenge in a way. They have to generate income for universities. They have to maintain high student numbers. They have to be able to sell products that organizations and students see as valuable. But at the same time, they are seen as significantly responsible for influencing change in both the economy and business, if you like, business norms. And so I think what we need to start doing is thinking differently about what we teach, how we teach. And that needs to start with how we lead business schools. Business schools are complex emotional arenas. And if we are going to rise to the challenge of both today and tomorrow, we need to recast those emotional arenas with new norms and rules. We need to start acknowledging, both as leaders in practice, but also in our curriculum, the dark side of emotional labour in leadership contexts. We need to acknowledge and accept that leadership is challenging, it's complex, and it comes at a cost. And it's a cost that is not on the balance sheet, and it is not written in a business case, but it is a cost to those individuals. And so what I want to kind of finish with really is the challenge that business school leadership must reflect and embody the values that will enable a sustainable and fairer tomorrow. If we are really going to affect change, we need to start by doing that within ourselves. Okay, thank you very much. Let me stop sharing my screen. Okay.
That was amazing, Professor Ward. That kind of insight across 38 years, I think you said, of research from the time it was originally published in book form. And to be able to capture that and synthesize that is no easy feat. I now realize one of the things I've missed in the context of the pandemic is that live lecture. I know I didn't experience it in full form today, but it was great. Thank you very much for that experience. I want to encourage those both in the classroom. I understand that each one has their own connection, both in the classroom and those of us that have joined us strictly online to post questions, comments, reactions, ideas in the chat, and I will do my best to curate them as we go. In fact, I realize there are two places. There's a Q&A place, and then there's the chat place. I'll do my best to manage across both of them. But our first question has actually arrived. Do you feel the marginalization of negative dimensions of emotional labor indicative of the broader romanticization of leadership? I think I'm reading this incorrectly. Do you feel the marginalization of negative dimensions of emotional labor is indicative of the broader romanticization of leadership? If so, what do you feel should we do, I'll add a few words here, to redress the balance? Right away, digging right into the depth of your ideas, Professor Ward. Any reaction to that?
I think that's a really interesting question, and I really like that articulation of the romanticization of leadership. But I think it's a huge question. I think for me there is still an inherent reluctance from organizations to acknowledge the emotional spectrum almost that exists within its emotional arena. We are still too narrowly defining what constitutes acceptable, and I think that is that comes from the top to some extent. It's a certain definition or acceptability of what constitutes good leadership. I think we have a duty in terms of being as business schools to really question and challenge that romanticization of leadership. Absolutely. And I think I'm always interested when I talk to students who come onto business courses and they kind of envision themselves as being the Richard Branson, the Steve Jobs of tomorrow. And that's a lovely idea, but we have to acknowledge that very few people are going to get to that position. Many of us, operate in very different different levels of organizations, and that comes with a whole kind of host of different demands and challenges. So I think to some extent that romanticization, I love that, of leadership is almost is overshadowing, I think, some of the realities and the darker side.
That's interesting. It reminds me of a conversation I once had with a professor at Stanford, Jeffrey Pfeffer. He wrote a book called Leadership BS. Yeah. And I called him immediately to talk about it, right? Because part of his main premise is that leadership education, really we don't yet have much evidence that it indeed works. So, how do we explore this a little bit more deeply? But one of the things he said is that often when we bring visitors to the classroom, some of the people you just mentioned, for example, they often come and they speak about the leader that they want to be, and less about the leadership experience they actually have. So they leave out the bad stuff, and they really focus on the good stuff. And I see a bunch of questions popped in, and I was about to ask my own. Let me go ahead and ask it anyway, because it may fit in with some other questions. But how to, thinking about your points about business school leadership, how do we do a better job of helping students to explore these kinds of questions? How do we teach this? Do we learn from the training programs of cabin crew from the past, right? Any ideas about that? And then I'll regroup on some of these questions, and then we'll move forward.
I think there are two aspects of that in response to that. I think one is we don't. I think what's really interesting is we don't. Even organisations today do not teach or train people how to perform emotional labour. I think in a way that was the case in the 1970s for cabin crew. When I did a piece of research with budget airlines, looking at their training program, they economized on that aspect. They just removed the emotional labor training, because essentially what we do is we replicate what we perceive to be what constitutes being a good cabin crew or a good leader. And so it's almost beyond the point now of needing to specify and curate what that emotional arena requires. It's almost like we're so adept at absorbing those cues, those display rules, that we can do that almost implicitly. But I think in terms of how we change, not necessarily change, how we just educate, I think, and inform, is as business schools, we have a moral responsibility to equip our future leaders, our future managers, our future economists, financiers, accountants, with a holistic skill set that helps them to understand the realities of the work that they will do. And I think we're not very good at that, at doing that in the main. I think we're very good at presenting a factual kind of account of what we expect, how we expect leaders in these spaces to operate, i.e. we kind of convey those the rules of the emotional arena, but we don't tell that human, that real side of how you deal with that on a day-to-day basis, what the real cost of that is for the individual. And I think until we can start having those really honest conversations in classrooms, I think we're doing a disservice both to individuals but also to organisations. You know, we look at the mental health crisis, for example, maybe as a I'm not going to go as far as to say a consequence, but certainly we need to factor that into consideration.
Great, thank you. The questions are rolling in now. I'm trying to synthesize as we speak and ask questions in the appropriate order, if I will. But I'm not sure I'll get it right. But let me just start with one of the earlier ones that came in. You know, based on your research, how common is it for leaders to incorporate their understanding of this skill into the decisions, actions that they make? I'm assuming with this question, we're talking about a variety of things, from strategy development to hiring decisions. Is this something that's prevalent already in the way leaders think, or do we have a long way to go before they're thinking about these things?
That's an interesting question, and I'm not, if I'm honest, I'm not sure I have a direct answer to that. I think implicitly leaders, affective/effective leaders, acknowledge the emotional complexity of their role. I think how much they talk about that and they consciously work to support others in developing that skill set by talking through those realities, I think is more limited. And we need a bit of a gear change, I think, on this. We need to stop presenting the kind of the shiny side of it. And don't get me wrong, there are lots of shiny sides, and we need the shine. But we also need to understand that those darker costs at the same time.
Yeah,
so that probably wasn't a very good response to that question, Dan. My apologies, but
well, it gives us something to follow up on, definitely. But I think you did. I think you did great. You know, in our world at GBSN, we think across borders, and as you do as well. And there's a question here about the concept of emotions, I think more generally, but I think emotional labor as it relates across cultures. You know, are there any insights that you could share that might help us to understand in that context, emotional labor?
That is an excellent question, and I think despite there being 38 years of emotional labour research, literature, much of which is actually empirical across such a diverse set of academic disciplines, it is still highly westernized in its presentation. And so it's a strange construct in a way, because if we think about the breadth of Hochschild's original thesis, we've marginalized the dark side. We focus then on how this manifests itself in predominantly Western contexts. And I think a lot of my work is to try and challenge those trajectories and those fundamental kind of, dare I say, misconceptualizations of the original text, to really get us to rethink, and rather than using Hochschild's work as a kind of wellspring, to go back and to look at it and really focus again on that, the depth, the breadth, and the theoretical foundation upon which it was built. That seems to kind of get lost in this proliferation of the study of emotional labour across a variety of disciplines. And so absolutely, I think it would be well worthwhile a concerted effort to de-Westernize, if you like, or to take a much more multicultural approach to the way emotional labour is both conceptualized but also practiced. I think that's really important in different cultures. You know, understanding the different cultural norms that influence different emotional arenas is, you know, it's a fundamental part of what's referred to as cultural intelligence, isn't it? So joining that up with the debates around emotional labour and those literatures, I think is absolutely valuable.
Thanks for that. You know, it adds to the starting point. I think you pointed out how complex leadership management really is, and this cultural dimension in the context of emotional labor adds great complexity right away. I'm going to try to combine a couple of questions here. One question came in about burnout, and I'm going to try to combine it with a question that really relates to change management. And you know, one of the things that, you know, I noted right away in your talk, and it's something that I think we don't think often enough, it's that cost, right? It's right, the, you know, thinking about it as a resource doesn't automatically imply that you really begin to internalize the cost, both individually and across the organization. And there's a question, again, not only about burnout, how long you can keep this up, but also about, you know, the cost of transforming an organization in a competitive environment, right? You know, and investing all of that energy means not investing potentially in other things, and competition can be a pretty significant factor. Any thoughts about that?
I mean, two things spring to mind really. One is to, I think, highlight that whilst today I think we're focusing on the costs of emotional labour, there was a debate in the late 80s around whether emotional labour should be constructed as something that always has negative consequences. So is it kind of almost fundamentally problematic to exchange emotions for a wage? So Hochschild's Marxist roots, if you like, set a trajectory for reading and building the construct in that particular way. However, Hochschild herself has been very keen to point out that this was never her intention, and to kind of separate that kind of the ethico-moral argument from the lived experience. So essentially what we mean there is her saying that, you know, you might actually really enjoy performing emotional labor. I am performing emotional labor and I am enjoying it. I might need a lay down in a moment, you know, when it's all over, but you know, it's not always negative. There's not always those automatic negative consequences. And I start from that point in response to the question, because the psychological literature has predominantly seen and positioned and therefore researched emotional labor from that starting point, that actually it will have negative consequences. And so we see there that literature manifesting itself around issues like burnout, emotional exhaustion, dissonance. And so what we need to, I guess, think about is this as a lived individual experience. So for some people, they might very much like, I guess, the challenge of expending an awful lot of emotional energy into a change program. And actually, they might find that very rewarding and nourishing, I guess. So that, you know, that particular individual might have the appetite to do that again and again. And we see people that are very much have this skill set. They're brought into organizations in order to affect change, and then they move on to their next change project. But I think the important thing to remember is it's a lived experience for that individual. And I think acknowledging that not everybody has an equality of emotional resource, let's say, does not necessarily mean that they're in any way lacking. It's just understanding the self, I think, as a leader, and understanding that emotional landscape that exists within all of us in terms of how you manage that. So I think, you know, it makes me think about, you know, repetitive change syndrome and all of those kind of things. But individual people respond differently to those things, don't they? And I think that's the importance of constructs like emotional labor always brings us back to, it will depend on the individual.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And you know, one of the ways I hear what you're saying is that when you're thinking about your team, understanding their skill set as it relates to emotional labor, really being in tune with that as a critical skill matters if you're going through this transformation. Now, I need to apologize. I misread I didn't read carefully enough. I didn't misread. There's a part of that question about burnout that if you could just in 30 seconds or so offer a couple of suggestions from your experience about how we might manage if we as individual leaders begin to feel like we're reaching that stage of burnout. You know, we're too emotionally invested, and over a long enough period of time where we begin to wonder about our commitment. I think, you know, honestly, many of us in organizations are feeling that way today, and over the course of this set of pivots, changes that we've been making in the pandemic. Any just quick pieces of advice from your experience?
I did have a final slide which had some of these kind of things on it, so I preempted the question, but I didn't quite go there. So I'm just going to read these out for brevity. So talking about, I think, the dark side and the challenges is incredibly important. This is about acknowledging that this is a skill set. It's not about weakness. And doing that is incredibly liberating once you start to verbalize how, you know, those issues of emotion within organizational context. Obviously, things around acknowledging the importance of rest and self-care should be both taught and embodied. And leadership teams need to find space to ensure that that's provided, I think, throughout an organization. Evidence-based approaches to decision making. Now, I say this with some caveat. I think, you know, there is also, we can't deny that there is a heart in some of those things that we do. But focusing on the detail and the big picture, I think, in equal measure is important. So seeing where you want to get to, rather than focusing on those micro interactions. I think the final kind of thing I'd want to say, and I think this is something I am wrestling with as a leader, is you need to maintain your integrity at all points. You know, I think the minute we start to let go of that, you know, your morals and your emotions, they're non-refundable. You've got to live with yourself forever. That's beyond this job role. That's beyond your career. And so having that real sense of yourself and your own values, I think, is incredibly important in leadership.
Understood. In fact, I think you've at least started to address one of the other questions that went into the chat, and that's about this interaction or balance with emotional labor and things that are becoming especially important, or have become especially important in business schools, related to ethics and corporate social responsibility. Do you want to add anything to what you just said about this commitment to the ethics?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really passionate about a certain set of things. That for me is my integrity. I'm incredibly passionate about EDI, about sustainability, and I think we need to, as I've said before, we need to reimagine what the emotional arena of the business school, because change in organizations starts with us. We have to model what is acceptable in the emotional arena of an organization. That, I think, is our almost our moral responsibility as business schools. That's where we can have probably the most influence, is shifting the norms around emotional displays, what is or is not acceptable within organizations. It's okay to call out prejudice. It's okay to say how you feel, how somebody has made you feel. And I think if we can get to that level of understanding, and we kind of drop the facade of particular things are okay because they're said in a particular context, that, I think, is the only way that we really mobilize change.
Thank you. There's one other question in the chat that I'd like us to end on. But before we get to that one, I'd like to ask a question that's been hovering over my head as I listened to the presentation and thought about the questions. The fourth industrial revolution, if you sort of get at its core, is this intersection between technology, economics, and biology. And I'm wondering if you've put any thought into, or worked with others that are thinking about the role of artificial intelligence in all of this, as we begin to use facial recognition more extensively, as we think about, I know there are tools now where you could be alerted about the tone of your email and about the emotion you might be expressing. And any thoughts about how this either increases or decreases the importance of emotional labor moving forward? How does this work? What do we need to worry about?
I think personally we need to be very worried. I mean, I guess if we think about Hoshev's original contribution, it was to say, to make the fundamental point that organizations were no longer just interested in controlling our physical labor power. They were now looking to shift that reach, if you like, of control into what were once seen as private parts of the self, i.e. how we felt our emotions. And so I guess the concern here through these technologies that you identify is that, again, this is a transformative leap in that sense of control. and emotions are highly complex and very subtle. And to, you know, my concern, I guess, is that, you know, it really, we start to internalize these external rules into, you know, ourselves, and that, you know, we have to be so careful. If you think about Facebook and the invention of the like button, for example, we never envisaged, you know, the connection there between that technological kind of, I get that almost micro technological shift, you know, to the impact on, I don't know, you know, youth suicides, for example, or, you know, so I think we just have to have that moral, that ethical lens placed on the emotional impacts of these technological advancements.
Thanks. I know that's a both a worrisome question and a tough question, given how quickly technology moves and the differences across countries and the way they think about privacy and the role of companies. Thanks for that. I want to end with a question. I think it gives you the opportunity to sum things up a bit, Professor Ward, but early on in the Q&A, there's a question about the work of Solovey and Mayer, 1990. This must be an academic or a well-versed student that posted this question. Described four levels of emotional intelligence required for good leadership or effective leadership. Is the idea of emotional work or emotional labor a new required trait? Should we be thinking about the fifth dimension as it relates to emotional labor?
Oh, I think I could spend quite a while responding to that question. I think fundamentally emotional intelligence really is grounded in the notion of emotional labor anyway. So I guess my understanding is that rather than it being a fifth dimension, it's actually, you know, a kind of, the emotional intelligence construct is almost like an infrastructure that has been used to quantify that kind of ability to perform the emotional labor itself. And whether you agree with that or not, I think is a you know, it's a whole nother session for another day. But yeah, so I wouldn't say it's a fifth. I would say it's a foundation, if you like.
Well, speaking for all of us, we look forward to that whole nother session for another day, because this has been great, Professor Ward. I want to thank you on behalf of all of the attendees, both in person, live there, and online. And I want to thank all the participants. What a great set of questions and conversations that emerged from this. It's obvious that you were engaged, that you were a part of this experience, and that to us is part of what we're learning. So thank you all. I'm not sure exactly how this arrangement calls for closure, to be honest with you, because the folks in the room simply can't press the leave button. But and everybody online, please do join us next time. We'll make sure to see you soon.
Thank you ever so much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ward.